What makes a monster? Is a killer born, or does he emerge from the silence of a father? Jeffrey Dahmer didn't just kill, he became a symbol of unfathomable horror. He murdered, dismembered, and consumed 17 victims. But behind the monster was another man, his father, Lionel Dahmer. In his memoir, A Father's Story, Lionel doesn't just recount his son's crimes, he turns inward, dissecting his own emotional detachment, rigid control, and the silence that defined their relationship. This is not the story of a monster, but the story of a man who raised him. A man haunted by a single tormenting question: did I play a role in creating him? Was my silence, my unwillingness to see, as lethal as the impulses that drove my son to kill? This is Damage Control, and this is a report on Lionel Dahmer: how I raised a serial killer. Lionel Dahmer was a scientist, and his approach to life reflected the meticulous precision of his profession. As a chemist, he approached problems methodically, seeking solutions in facts and formulas. But the same traits that made him successful in the lab often left him emotionally disconnected at home. He describes himself as highly analytical, a man whose need for order masked an inability to confront the unpredictable messiness of relationships. This dissonance became painfully apparent in his interactions with Jeffrey, where meaningful engagement was often substituted for detachment. As Jeffrey grew older, Lionel's discomfort with confrontation became a defining feature of their relationship. Rather than delve into his son's emotional struggles, he opted for a fragile peace. He writes, "I had come to accept the wall that separated me with my son. I'd even come to think of it not so much as a wall, but as a shield which both of us needed if we were to communicate at all. It was as if we had agreed to speak only of the most banal things, because each of us knew there were other things which, if honestly confronted, would tear us both apart." This aversion to emotional depth stemmed in part from Lionel's own childhood. As a boy, he grappled with the darker side of his personality also, a fascination with fire that led him to near disaster. Lionel's childhood obsession with fire reveals a critical parallel to Jeffrey's later fixations. "While indulging my obsession, one summer afternoon, I nearly burned down a neighbor's garage." Lionel mentions numerous times in his book his craving for control, rooted in his own childhood insecurities, became a generational blueprint. Where Lionel channeled his compulsions into chemistry, a socially acceptable outlet, Jeffrey lacked such guidance. Jeffrey's childhood grew darker. As a child, Jeffrey developed a disturbing fixation on dissecting animals, collecting bones and observing death. Lionel dismissed these early warning signs, rationalizing them as the innocent curiosities of a future scientist. He reflects, "At the time, it seemed like a young boy making sense of the world, a future biologist perhaps." Lionel admitted to seeing reflections of his own boyhood curiosity in Jeffrey's fixation with bones and death. But where Lionel's urge for control found its outlet in science, Jeffrey's interest lacked a healthy framework, allowing them to evolve into something more sinister. But this rationalization was accompanied by a chilling moment Lionel couldn't ignore. He remembers finding Jeffrey playing with a pile of animal bones under the home. He later reflected on the eerie fascination Jeffrey showed as he repeatedly dropped to listen to the brittle sounds of the bones clattering on the ground. "Like fiddlesticks," Jeffrey had said with an odd laugh. "I could no longer view it simply as a childish episode, a passing fascination. It may have been nothing more than that, but now I have to see it through a different way, in a more sinister and macabre light." Instead of acting, Lionel compartmentalized these events, retreating to the sanctuary of his lab. For Lionel, science was predictable, manageable, a stark contrast to the emotional complexities of his family. Lionel's dismissal of Jeffrey's macabre curiosities mirrors what psychologist Leon Festinger termed cognitive dissonance, the mental gymnastics we perform to avoid truths that threaten our self-image. Confronting the troubling reality of Jeffrey's actions would have shattered Lionel's carefully constructed self-image of a dutiful father. To reconcile these conflicting truths, Lionel chose the easier path: denial. This retreat came at a cost. As Lionel immersed himself in the certainty of chemistry, Jeffrey was left to navigate the world of uncertainties alone. The unspoken distance between father and son became a breeding ground for Jeffrey's growing darkness. A space where fascination turned to obsession, an obsession turned to horror. Jeffrey Dahmer's descent into isolation began early. His mother Joyce endured a harrowing pregnancy marked by severe seizures and emotional instability. Lionel recounts these terrifying episodes in vivid detail. Times her legs would lock tightly in place, and her whole body would grow rigid and begin to tremble. Her jaw would jerk to the right and take on similarly frightening rigidity. During these strange seizures, her eyes would bulge like a frightened animal, and she would begin to salivate, literally frothing at the mouth. To manage these seizures, Joyce was prescribed barbiturates and morphine, a cocktail of powerful drugs that Lionel feared might have affected Jeffrey in utero. Prenatal exposure to morphine and barbiturates, as reportedly used by Joyce Dahmer, does pose significant risks to fetal neurodevelopment. Opioids like morphine have been linked to reduced brain volume, impaired self-regulation and heightened stress reactivity. Barbiturates are associated with neonatal and withdrawal symptoms, irritability and developmental delays, as well as risks of stillbirth and other complications. Such exposures may disrupt brain development, increasing the likelihood of cognitive, emotional, and behavior challenges later in life. But even after Jeffrey's birth, the tension in the Dahmer household didn't subside. By first grade, Jeffrey had withdrawn almost entirely. He avoided eye contact and spoke only when prompted, and spent hours alone. Psychiatrist Harvey Cleckley, in The Mask of Sanity, notes that extreme social withdrawal and flat affect in childhood can precede antisocial behavior. Jeffrey's teachers observed these traits as early as first grade. Lionel recalls, he had not responded to their casual approaches, nor made any approaches of his own. On the playground, he kept to himself, merely pacing about the schoolyard, doing what she, his teacher Miss Allen, described as nothing. Lionel also recalls volatile arguments that left Jeffrey withdrawn and detached. Joyce Dahmer, however, publicly rejected Lionel's portrayal of their marriage. In rare statements to the press, she dismissed the father's story as a pack of lies, and accused Lionel of rewriting history to absolve him of blame. As the tension between Lionel and Joyce escalated, so did Jeffrey's emotional detachment. The Dahmers' arguments were frequent and volatile, leaving Jeffrey to process his parents' rage in silence. Children often process familial discord inwardly, retreating to their own worlds as a way of coping. Jeffrey's world, however, grew darker, shaped by an atmosphere of volatility and neglect. A pivotal moment came when Jeffrey poisoned a classmate's tadpoles with motor oil. Lionel reflects, "To my knowledge, this was Jeff's first act of violence, a fleeting moment. The darker Jeff emerged in the form of a little boy pouring motor oil into a bowl of tadpoles." Lionel's memoir is as much a confession as it is a reflection. He acknowledges that denial played a central role in his parenting. As Jeffrey's behavior grew more alarming, Lionel clung to the plausible explanations rather than confront the truth.
One of the things I'd like to tell parents is don't disregard shyness. Things can be fomenting in that young mind. Dig. Just pull out everything that you possibly can. Don't stop. Yes.
Years later, in a rare on-camera interview, Lionel would plead with other parents. A plea born of hindsight and regret. At the time, Lionel's analytical instincts failed him when rancid odors began wafting from Jeffrey's grandmother's basement, the site of his first murder. Jeffrey brushed off the concerns. Offering an explanation, Lionel accepted without question. He explained that he often had time on his hands, and that he liked to experiment with bleachers and muriatic acid on old chicken parts which he bought from a local grocery store. Lionel's memoir is haunted by the guilt of these decisions. He reflects on how his silence and rationalizations may have enabled Jeffrey to escalate unchecked, but his guilt also reflects a painful truth about parenthood. The line between nurturing and enabling can be razor thin. The pinnacle of Lionel's denial came with the infamous locked box. When Lionel demanded to see inside, Jeffrey deflected, claiming it contained porno magazines. Lionel explains how this moment could have been pivotal in stopping Jeff on Dr. Phil.
But we now know the box contained a human head.
Yes.
And
it would have stopped. And I said, well, what would you have done, Jeff, if I had opened it? And he said something like, the jig would have been up.
The basement itself became a place of mystery, a forbidden zone where Jeffrey's secrets festered, both literally and metaphorically. These smells, the locked box, the strange behavior, these were all red flags Lionel chose to ignore, feeding into the silence that shielded Jeffrey's growing monstrosity. Leon Festinger's seminal theory on cognitive dissonance explains how individuals experience psychological discomfort when holding conflicting beliefs. Modern neuroscience supports this. A 2016 fMRI study by Vincent Van Veen, a neuropsychologist, found that cognitive dissonance activates the anterior cingulate cortex, the brain's conflict monitoring hub. Lionel's rationalizations, accepting implausible explanations for rancid smells or the locked box, could be seen as neural efforts to suppress the distressing truth about his son. To acknowledge Jeffrey's monstrosity would mean acknowledging his own failure as a father. He further writes, "It was as if I had locked my son in a soundproof booth, then drawn the curtains so that I could neither hear nor see what he had become." A study by Dr. Adrian Rain, detailed in his book, The Anatomy of Violence, highlights how early intervention can disrupt this trajectory. But for intervention to occur, someone has to acknowledge the signs. How many of Jeffrey's actions were warnings that went ignored? How often do parents overlook the darker sides of their children, choosing to see what they want to believe? And how many tragedies could be prevented if denial wasn't such a powerful force? Lionel's greatest fear wasn't merely his failure as a father. It was a realization that he and Jeffrey were more alike than he wanted to admit. Both father and son shared a psychological fear of abandonment, though they expressed it in vastly different ways. Reflecting on Jeffrey's chilling explanation for his crimes, Lionel writes, "In general, Jeff had simply wanted to keep people permanently, to hold them fixedly within his grasp, by which practice Jeff had hoped to ensure that his victims would never leave him." Lionel also acknowledges his own darker impulses, a need for control that mirrored Jeffrey's. Even more to the point, however, was the sense of control that my own need for permanence and stability had generated in me, along with the accompanying dread of anything that I could not control. While Lionel's memoir avoids clinical labels, both father and son exhibited traits consistent with autism spectrum disorder. Rigid thinking, intense fixations, and struggle with emotional reciprocity. Where they diverged was their environments. Research indicates that individuals with deficits in emotional processing and impulse control are at higher risk of engaging in violent behaviors. For example, dysfunctions in the prefrontal cortex and amygdala regions of the brain have been associated with impaired moral judgments and increased aggression. For Jeffrey, neglect became the prism through which his fixations refracted. Cataloguing insect wings morphed into dissecting roadkill. Anatomical curiosity curdled into morbid obsession. A 2002 meta-analysis by Rhee and Waldman in Psychological Bulletin suggests that genetic factors account for approximately 41% of antisocial behaviors. Traits like impulsivity and aggression can be inherited but often require environmental triggers. For example, the low-activity variant of the MAOA gene, sometimes referred to as the warrior gene, can be linked to increased aggression in individuals who experience childhood maltreatment. Dr. Avisham Caspi's research show how neglect can weaponize genetic vulnerabilities. Prenatal exposure to Joyce's barbiturates and morphine, drugs known to disrupt fetal serotonin pathways, may have further primed Jeffrey's brain for dysregulation. Per a 2019 NIH report, combined with Lionel's emotional absence, this environment could have turned latent risks into catastrophe. Lionel's fear of abandonment and Jeffrey's necrophilic obsession may have shared the same genetic roots, but the ways they manifested were worlds apart. Lionel sought control through structure and stability, while Jeffrey's fear of loss drove him to horrific extremes. Reflecting on their connection, Lionel writes, "My son was perhaps only the deeper, darker shadow of myself." At Jeffrey's trial, Lionel sat frozen as his son described boiling heads in acid and storing organs in formaldehyde. He writes, "I listened to his voice as he describes inconceivable acts. It is a monotone, utterly unaccented and unemotional. I see and I hear my son and I think, am I like that?" Lionel's memoir ends not with answers but with a haunting question. What survives in the silence between a father and son? For Jeffrey, it was the lifetime of screams. For Lionel, an echo of guilt. The fear that his own shadows birthed a monster. He writes, "Now, many months after Jeff's trial and our ordeal, I remain a man in constant rumination, often tortured in soul by the deeds of my offspring. I find that I remain in the grip of a great unknowing, both in terms of Jeff himself and my effect upon him as a father by omissions and commissions. Fatherhood remains at last a grave enigma, and when I contemplate that my other son may one day be a father, I can only say to him, as I must every father after me, take care, take care, take care." In the end, Lionel Dahmer's story is a warning, a reminder that silence can be lethal, that denial is a form of complicity, and that the darkest impulses often begin not in the mind of a killer, but in the unspoken voids of those who raised him. Thanks for watching this episode of Damage Control. Share this with someone whose dad only ever gave them the silent treatment, and help us keep bringing you deep dives from the darker side of life.